The Liberals and the opposition are taking different views of that. I'll explain it in a second, but I want to bring in the front bench who have been listening in to that press conference. They're standing by to react to what we're talking about. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now a principal at Shakti Strategies. Jason Leader is a veteran of conservative war rooms. He's now president of Enterprise Canada. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is here, and Marika Walsh is as well. She's a senior political reporter with the Globe and Mail. So it's a bit complicated, Marika. I want to try and distill it for everybody listening, but how we got to this place is essentially there is a piece of legislation that earlier in the year would have seen the exemption for farmers when it comes to the carbon tax expanded to include natural gas and propane and the heating and cooling of their barns. It made its way to the Senate. Things got complicated because there was a carbon tax, another exemption offered for home heating fuel, and the Liberals said, that's it, we're not doing any more. So this would have put them in a precarious position. A whole lot of lobbying ensued that resulted in an amendment being passed. The Conservatives say gutted the bill. In response, they say that they're going to do what they can to keep everybody in the House of Commons through the holidays in order to force the government to repeal the carbon tax, basically, on farmers and Indigenous people and almost wholly, basically. What do you think of what we heard from the House Leader about what the Conservatives are saying they want to do?
I think they're each trying to win public opinion with their positioning. Pierre Poilievre is trying to wedge the government as far as possible on the carbon price because the government made the first climb down. The government made the first carve out. And it's interesting because the NDP also supported the bill that now the Conservatives are championing in the House of Commons and the NDP are nowhere on. And so I think that there is a lot of procedural, there's a lot of sort of he said, she said going on. The fact is that this is what happens in the House of Commons. The Liberals, when they were in opposition, forced overnight voting with Stephen Harper. I think it's fair to say that more of it is happening lately with the Conservatives on the official opposition side and a minority government where the Liberals have less control. But this is not totally something new that we're seeing. At the end of the day, though, it usually ends with an agreement to go home for the Christmas break.
Jason, what is the strategy here being employed by the Conservatives as you see it?
I mean, we're talking about the issue, right? The issue for Pierre Poilievre and his team is keep the focus right on the carbon tax. Now, this bill passed by the House of Commons, as was mentioned, went to the Senate, and it was gutted. I mean, they took the key provisions out of it. Several Liberal cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister, calling senators all weekend trying to get it gutted. They got it gutted. It got sent to the House of Commons. The Conservatives said, absolutely not, sort of over our dead body, move back. And here's the thing, right? Parliament Hill pretends to be talking about the price of food today. We're going to talk about that maybe later, right? Parliament Hill the government pretends to care about that stuff. Well, here was a concrete set of measures to take, some big prices, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs off farmers for heat, for grain drying, for all of those kinds of things. The government went the other way because of their sort of ideological agenda. The Conservatives are using a procedural tactic to try and get some attention on it. It's working. There's an argument. You can see how mad the Liberals are. The Liberals are furious. It's like Pierre Poilievre invented filibustering, as Marika said. Of course he didn't. This is something that happens all the time. And here we are. And we're talking about it. So the tactic is working.
Yeah, I think the gamble from the Conservatives, Tom, is that the focus is on the carbon tax and that they look further like champions of getting rid of it. I think the play by the Liberals in what we just heard, though, was a further association, as you could hear there from the House Leader, of the Conservatives with sort of the tactics that you could see employed on the right in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that has merit, and it certainly could be debated, but that's the strategy they seem to be employing that they think will resonate with Canadians.
Exactly. And having participated, in one or two filibusters, both in my career in Quebec City and in Ottawa, when we came back after the Orange Wave against the Conservatives in 2011, Jack was only a few weeks away from leaving us, and we put together a filibuster on an issue involving a strike at the Canada Post that was one for the record books, and I believe that still stands. So there's nothing new about this. And to hear the Conservatives going into a state of high dudgeon over the fact that these unelected senators dared reverse something, we had a bill on climate change enacted by the House of Commons that was overturned by the Conservative senators. There's nothing new under the sun. I do think, honestly, though, that the Conservatives had better be careful not to overplay their hand. People want a little bit more ho, ho, ho and a little bit less arg from the pirates going over the edge of the ship right now. And if they were to ever do what they're threatening to do, I think that they'd pay a price for it. I think that Poilievre has succeeded largely an incredible effort to rebrand himself. Softer, friendlier, lose the tie, lose some of the Brill Green, get rid of the glasses, drop your voice an octave, not always that scratchy finger pointing thing that he used to do. This is that old Poilievre coming back. Oh, and by the way, to the musical question, is he in Montreal? I can tell you, yes, he is. And he was lighting a candle on a menorah for the first night of Hanukkah. And I guess there is a little bit of fundraising involved in one of the events he's going to be going to tonight. But I'm sure he'll show up sometime around 3 a.m. to make sure he's there for a couple of the votes anyway.
Sabrina, what's the calculation, do you think, from the Liberals in holding a press conference, right in the middle of when the political shows are on? I think they know who they're speaking to. What do they want Canadians to be absorbing?
This is one of the times I kind of love not being in the Ottawa bubble, because it's such inside. And, what's happening in the House of Commons, what's happening in the government lobby right now, and with us talking about this on this show, very little of this is filtering down to moms and dads in hockey arenas or at school pickup. And so, I think what the Liberals are trying to do is make it filter down. They're trying to put the pin specifically on Pierre to try and continue to make him unlikable. And as Tom mentioned, there was this large rebranding campaign all summer to try and make him be more appealing and appeal to women. And over the last 2 weeks, we've seen that slowly fade away, and the real Pierre is back, right? This is not the first time he's led a filibuster. He did the same thing in 2019. And with each passing moment, he becomes more and more unlikable. And I think if I was a Liberals, I would continue to focus on that, because the more you can put the pressure on it, the more it gets to his head and the more the real Pierre comes out. Whether he's fighting with journalists, whether he's, taking the carbon tax as the reason to vote against the Ukraine agreement, whether he's eating an apple for 9 minutes, all of these things, I think, continue to peel that facade back. And that's what I would do if I was going to politicize this from the Liberals. On the other hand, they should continue to focus the message on affordability.
I was just quickly going to say, Marika, the interesting thing will be to see is if, the more frequent, for example, invocations of what's happening south of the border and trying to align, Pierre Poilievre with the right in the U.S., whether that proves, and all the things Sabrina just left it, whether that actually proves to be effective. Because so far, even though he had that bad week, for example, in Ukraine, that Abacus poll that was conducted right after that showed that the Conservatives had gone up by 3 points.
That's right. I think the calculation from the Conservatives is actually Sabrina's calculation, that this is not filtering down to the rest of the population. So Pierre Poilievre can sort of lead the charge and sort of get under the skin of the Liberals in the House of Commons, and they can sort of trade barbs, and it is personal for Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre, and that kind of stuff doesn't filter down to Canadians. That's, I think, part of the calculation, and I think part of the reason why Pierre Poilievre has been leading the charge on this. I think more broadly, both the Liberals and the Conservatives are using rhetoric that could be seen as over the top from either side. We saw the Prime Minister calling the Conservatives MAGA conservatives. There was the ad comparing Poilievre to Trump. There is now the suggestion that this is a government shutdown a la US, which it is not. People are still being paid. Programs are still running. And I think the issue for the Liberals is, does that attack on Pierre Poilievre and the Trump comparison actually land? Because the last Liberal that tried to make that attack was Kathleen Wynne against Doug Ford.
Maybe they think Pierre Poilievre is a different kind of competition. I don't know. They'll see. I do want to make sure we get in a full round on the big kind of news of the day outside of the Ottawa bubble, Sabrina, which is the emissions cap that the federal government has now finally announced. Let me play you a little bit of, I think it's the Minister of Environment or maybe the Minister of Energy, and then also reaction from Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith.
We wanted to take the time that was needed to ensure that we had all our ducks in a row. But we also did a lot of consultations with provinces, with companies, with experts, environmental organizations, indigenous groups, to make sure that what we're putting out there is reasonable.
With his pronouncement today, singling out the oil and gas sector alone for punitive federal treatment, Justin Trudeau and his eco-extremist Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault, are risking hundreds of billions of dollars in investment in Alberta's and Canada's economy.
Jason, the Fed seemed here with the details being announced to try and walk a line between saying this isn't going to amount to a production cap, but it will be a stringent enough emissions cap that we are still able to meet our targets in 2030. How do you think they walk that line? What's your evaluation of that?
Tells you everything you need to know. I mean, 5 years ago, to have Justin Trudeau sort of have to go in front of everybody and admit that he was weakening his quote unquote production cap. You know, this was not a good message today. They've been really muddled on both carbon taxation and the oil and gas sector. They try to punt it past the next election. These only would come into place in 2026. Listen, they're not making anybody happy, right? If you're a sort of an eco-extremist, as the Premier of Alberta was talking about there, you're really pretty frustrated with Justin Trudeau and his government. And if you're sort of a supporter of the oil and gas industry, certainly you've got a better option probably in front of you over the next little bit. Listen, they don't want to talk about this anymore, and that tells you everything you need to know about how Justin Trudeau is doing just generally, right? In 2015, they wanted everyone to know exactly what they were doing in terms of canceling pipelines, possibly shutting down the oil and gas industry, talking about it as though it's something that has to go, and it has to go relatively quickly. Today was very weak sauce, very within gruel, and I think that they're not making anybody happy, and you can see how conflicted they are politically. They actually don't know what to do.
Sabrina, do you agree with the assessment that it was quote unquote weak sauce?
I actually don't. I think that the emissions cap today and the way that we saw this positioned reflects some conversation with the oil and gas industry. I think we heard multiple times over the press conference that they had consulted with organizations like Pathways, that they had gone and talked to the oil and gas industry itself. And I think there's a lot of evidence that the industry itself was already moving in this direction. And I don't think that this necessarily hurts them. What I think is interesting is when you look at Danielle Smith's response, which is like lighting her hair on fire, which I think we could have expected. Alberta is best when it is ambitious. We've already reduced methane targets 7 years in advance of when we were 3 years in advance of when we were supposed to. We phased out coal 7 years in advance of when we were supposed to. And so I don't really understand why, she continues to light her hair on fire on these targets that we're already achieving. And when she talks about the fact that we're risking billions of dollars of investment, she herself did that earlier this year when she risked $30 billion of investment with the renewable moratorium. And so Danielle Smith is a bigger risk to the Alberta economy, I think, causing instability, detracting investment in this low carbon future than I think the federal government is.
I just have 3 minutes left in the show. I want to make sure I get both Tom and Marika in. Tom, what's your take on what they announced today?
It's a very good move. The carbon tax that we've been talking about, Vashi, is just that. It's a tax. It cannot guarantee a reduction of greenhouse gases, which is what you have to do if you want to fight climate change. We learned that in the Atlantic provinces. People were not going to reduce the amount of home heating fuel. They were just going to pay more for it. So that was the part that wasn't working. Here, it's very clever. A cap and trade system has already worked in Canada. We invented it with the cap and trade system that a progressive conservative prime minister, Brian Mulroney, put in place with the Americans to deal with acid rain. The culprit then wasn't CO2, it was SO2 mostly. When mixed with water, it was raining acid on the forests in eastern Canada. The Americans and Canadians got together, put a cap on the emissions. Companies like Inco that had steadfastly refused to put in scrubbers, all of a sudden, it was cheaper for them to do that than to buy credits in the market that gets created under a cap and trade system. It's elegant, it'll work, it forces creativity. Something called the Porter hypothesis has existed for 30 odd years, and it's been proven any number of times. This produces innovation, creativity. It adds a lot of value to these companies. Inco, by the way, had a whole new revenue stream because it learned that it could start selling the sulfur. It's a good move by the Liberals. Finally, on environment, a good move that everyone can applaud.
Okay, so speaking of that, what's interesting is maybe from a policy perspective, it was, and I'm not an expert, but it was a sound move. But you still have industry, Marika, reacting, saying this could amount to production cuts and it might make investment flee. And then you have people on the environmental side saying the timeline isn't quick enough. We're okay maybe with the policy, but this doesn't go far or fast enough as we would like.
Yeah, and I actually think the Liberals are probably okay in that middle section there. I think if we're talking about swaying public opinion, swaying the people, the soccer moms, the people in the ice rinks right now, unlike the last conversation where both the Conservatives and the Liberals have really high-handed rhetoric, you saw in those clips that you played that the government came across as sort of trying to be reasonable and pragmatic today, while others like the Alberta Premier were ringing like a 10-alarm fire. And I think the government wants to have that message and that tone and hopes to keep the voters and the electorate on side with that argument around climate change, and that's their focus.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I wish we could talk about this longer. We probably will, because it won't. The draft regulations aren't even coming until the middle of next year. Thank you so much to our front bench. Really appreciate it. Sabrina Grover, Jason Leader, Tom Mulcair, and Marika Walsh. We will certainly keep our eye on the House as that marathon voting continues throughout the evening. I'm Vashi Kapelos. That does it for Power Play. The debate with Mike LeCouture is coming up next, right after your top headlines. Have a great evening.